Well, now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker this afternoon. He's asked me to be brief because we do have a lot to get through. So all I will say is that Andrew Mawson is founder and president of the renowned Bromley by Bow Centre in East London, and co-founder and president of Community Action Network, a national charity supporting 850 social entrepreneurs across the UK. Will you please give a very warm welcome to Lord Andrew Mawson. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that very kind welcome, and it's great to be back in Wales again. We lived in Wales with our family for about 14 years in mid-Wales, although I have to say we would just get this blue sky till we got to Swindon, and then it started to rain, and I thought, this feels like Wales, but really nice to be with you. And I've spent 30 years really in the housing movement, and I can remember it many years ago, housing associations, which were begun really as small entrepreneurial ventures really by people who began to challenge actually some of the traditional ideas about housing. And of course it became quite successful, and gradually the state and the civil service got involved in the movement. And having been involved in developing a £300 million housing company in East London, which I'll say more about, as that process began, one began to watch the devil in the detail of what began to happen to the entrepreneurial flair that was in the DNA of housing. More of that later. Investment in housing actually is now billions of pounds. I had to speak at a very large conference like this in England not very long ago. And I said to the conference in England, not about Wales, but in England, the housing movement now has billions of pounds of public sector capital monies being spent in it. It actually has more money being spent in it than Richard Branson. The problem is, in England, I said to the conference, why is your branding more like Woolworths than Virgin? Ask yourself. Why is the quality in England of some of this stuff we're actually building not that great, but mediocre? How do we actually begin to get more bang for our buck? And when I became involved in creating Poplar Harca, a housing company in East London, I said to the then minister, which was just before the Blair years, I'm not interested actually in becoming involved in setting up yet another housing association that spends capital money and builds boxes. What I'm interested in is how we take the £300 million of investment and we use it in an innovative way to trigger social and economic development in these housing estates. Because what one began to see was the dependency culture that actually this investment was in danger in the detail of encouraging. So how do we get into making a difference with this money? Here is all this macro question of billions of pounds of investment. How do you actually begin to get into really making a difference and really using it not just to build housing, but to build communities? What I'd like to talk to you about is what it's been like in one place in the East End of London and staying in a housing estate for 25 years and watching the devil and the detail of what happened. Many years ago, I met someone called Paul Preston, who was an American entrepreneur who brought McDonald's into Britain. You might hate McDonald's, but actually he was a pretty shrewd guy. And when I first met him, he was talking endlessly about one shop he was building in Woolwich at that time. And what he was worrying about was, where do I get the chairs from that I can drag across the floor 600 times a day without the legs falling off? Where do I get the tiles from that will not crack by month 8? Where do I get the meat from and the milk from that arrives fresh each day? How do I make one shop really work really well before I end up building, is it 2,000 shops or whatever it is today? He understood as a business person, and I grew up in Bradford, by the way, when Morrison built his first supermarket. I went to it, yeah? He understood that first you must understand the micro, the detail of one place, before you build 1,000. Yet I have noticed over the years the public sector in its various guises uses words like social justice, fairness, equality, all these apple pie and mother words that trip off the tongue far too easily, and it thinks it can build 2,000 new schools, 2,000 new homes, 2,000 health centres, before it has actually understood the devil and the detail of one, actually. And then we wonder by year 8 why some of it is back into mediocrity and actually it hasn't really worked. So I'd like to share with you this afternoon the story of one place and focus on one place and try and understand the devil and the detail of staying around for a quarter of a century. When I first arrived in Bromley-by-Bow, just to locate it in the heart of the Lowley Valley, we are now 250 yards from the Olympic site. But when I first arrived 25 years ago, in the middle of a housing estate as a young clergyman, what I was greeted with was a run-down Protestant church-like barn, like many church buildings I've been around in Wales, all very similar. A 200-seater church with 12 elderly people in a room bigger than this, all over 70, sitting where they'd always sat, and it looked as though the dead had been carried out and no one had noticed. Yeah? And I was meant to stand in a pulpit like this and give words of wisdom to people who were 3 times my age. Sort of crazy. And when I began to think, what assets have we got, I realised we had some run-down church buildings, 120 years old, 12 elderly people all over 70, and £400 in the bank. Not very much, you might think. And when I began to realise what was outside our buildings, I realised we had a whole range of 60s and 50s housing estate, 55 languages and dialects in 10 minutes walk of our building, and anyone who could get out had got out, and 97% of all the money running around these housing estates was from the public sector, and massive dependency culture, and all the human realities of all of that. And the question to little old me at that point was, what do you do about this? Answer, I haven't got the faintest idea. Maybe doing a runner is one option, yeah? But there were 3 other options I began to think about. One was, I could stay in my bed every morning and get depressed because this was all too much for me, yeah? Particularly when I'd come across Philip, the Jewish head teacher across the road, who was a really good guy who was retiring early and taking his pension because it had all become too much for him. And I'm thinking, that's me in 5 years' time, yeah? The second option was to hide away in my study and write a doctorate on poverty and become an expert as a way of never meeting Karen and her kids on the 7th floor of the tower block across the road, yeah? I can become an expert and write this very clever study about all this stuff, but never get hold of the material myself, actually. And I've noticed over the years how government actually loves these experts' reports, but when I meet lots of them, many of them have never built anything. The third option for me was to loiter with intent around these housing estates and try and understand what on earth was going on around here 25 years ago. And because I'm a nosy Yorkshireman from Bradford, loitering with intent and getting nosy was a real option. And I decided to go for it, yeah? And as I began to get nosy on these housing estates, I came across 25 years ago the voluntary sector, the social sector. And what did I see? Well, the voluntary sector and the social sector, to a large degree, had copied the public sector. It had lots of management committee meetings. It argued endlessly about equal opportunities policies. It read The Guardian. It drank coffee. It talked a lot and delivered very little of any practical consequence to anyone who lived around there. Actually, a lot of the culture was very unhappy indeed, you know? And actually, when you stayed a really long time, what you realised is that religion had moved out of the church. I know about religion, it's my core business. It had moved out of the church and it had moved into this sector, actually. Loads of ideology, actually. And when you stayed even longer, you realised, over time in these housing estates, some bits of it were part of the engine of poverty, actually. Certainly not part of the solution at that time. So I decided instinctually that I wasn't going to join that show, actually. But what do you do? Don't know. So me and these 12 old people decided we're going to give these buildings away. We've only got 2 years of life left. Let's just give them away and say yes to any individual from these housing estates around here who wants to have a go at something. We'll create a can-do culture. Let's get into individuals. And so what happened was a young woman called Janet wanted to develop a dance school, and I had a run-down church hall. And I met her and showed her around. And I realised, of course, what churches normally do is we hire a bit of our space and we give them a bit of room. We have nothing to do with them, we take a bit of money. And I realised, no, I'm not going to do that. And the judgment I made about Janet was simply, she had twinkly eyes, yeah? She had a bit of entrepreneurial flair, and I could feel that she was going to do some stuff, and I needed to achieve something in an area where nothing ever happened.